Welcome to the Frontlines of Leadership podcast, where my guests tell stories and share principles to inspire the rising generation of leaders. Today, I'm excited to welcome Nate Meikle to the podcast. Nate is an assistant professor at the University of Kansas School of Business. He is a graduate of Stanford Law School, former collegiate football player for BYU, and former radio broadcaster for IMG College Sports Radio. Nate's research on social perception and bias has been published in top-tier academic journals, including the Academy of Management Journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Organization Science, and the Harvard Business Review. Nate is the host of the podcast Meikles Dimes, a podcast dedicated to the simple, practical, and underappreciated. Guests of the podcast include Super Bowl champions, university presidents, Pulitzer Prize winners, Ivy League academics, four-star admirals, as well as award-winning filmmakers, authors, and business leaders. Nate is also the author of the memoir Little Miss, A Father, His Daughter, and Rocket Science, that chronicles the experience of teaching his 2-year-old daughter to read. In addition to earning his Juris Doctor, Nate earned an undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University, a doctorate from the University of Utah, and completed a postdoc at the University of Notre Dame. Hey, Nate, thanks for coming on today.
Absolutely, Jackson. Great to be here. I love talking about leadership.
Awesome. And for our listeners, I've been very excited to have Nate come on the podcast. Nate runs his own podcast, and he's been doing it for years and years now. And he was one of the ones who helped me kind of jumpstart and learn how to start my own, both logistically speaking, and then also kind of getting the motivation to jump in and being willing to put myself out there. So first of all, thank you, Nate, for that. And also just want to say how excited I am to interview you today.
Yeah, it's fun to be on the other side of it because I have been in your situation so many times and got into podcasting thanks to other people helping me. So it's fun to be here.
Awesome. And Nate, you've, as I've listened to your podcast, you've interacted with great leaders, coaches, military leaders, as many people as you could think of, hundreds of people that have their own abilities and stories about life. And so I'm interested and excited to hear you today. And we'll just jump in with the first question. This being about leadership and your personal stories, who's one of the greatest leaders you've had in your life, and what were some attributes they possessed that made their leadership stick out to you?
So I instantly think of Bronco Mendenhall. I played football at BYU from 2004 to 2006. And when I joined the team in 2004, the head coach was Gary Crowan. And I love Gary. He gave me a chance. I was a walk-on. He selected me to be on the team. I really like Gary. Nice guy, kind. I liked playing for him. But for whatever reason, there were a number of them, the team was not performing well. And the BYU administration hires Bronco Mendenhall as the head coach. And one of the first things he did is, well, backing up, at BYU under Croton, we had had 3 losing seasons for the first time in like 30 years, 3 losing seasons in a row. The team was a disaster. Notwithstanding Gary's best efforts and him being a really good guy who I think everybody liked. I think he was a well-liked leader. But the culture had got away from him. There were investigations of, serious allegations and investigations going on. I mean, it wasn't just the on-the-field stuff. There was a bunch of off-the-field stuff as well. So early on, Bronco takes over, and instead of practice one day, he drives us, we get in buses, and he drives us up the canyon, Provo Canyon, and he lights a campfire, and he says, I want you to write down all of the things that are wrong with the program. And so we get in groups, and we write them down. We spend like 30 minutes, whatever, and then we get to read them in front of the team, and then he threw them all in the fire. And then he said, now I want you to go back to your groups, and I want you to talk about what you're going to do to fix it. So we go back in our groups, and we present that as well. So he was really good at using metaphors and imagery to capture hearts and minds. And he was also being guided by a friend of mine who I became friends with through this experience, Paul Gustafson, who's an organizational design consultant and amazing consultant and thinker. And so that was one example of an activity that he did. Another one that I really liked is he drove us to the bottom of White Mountain. And he said, okay, it's going to be a race to the top. And it was a staggered start. The bigger guys started first and the more specialist guys started last. But it was a race to the top. And, hiking White Mountain, it's like a mile hike or whatever. I forget the elevation gain, but
yeah, it's not fun.
Yeah, it's not fun, but I've never raced up a mountain before. And when you're racing, I mean, it's just like, 10x is hard. One of the hardest things
Mhm.
I've ever done, just
Right.
racing up that whole mountain. I think I walked for maybe like, my memory is like I walked for like 30 yards and but basically was able to maintain a jog the whole because I had, like my teammates right there too.
Right.
So we get to the top, and then he starts talking about the view from the top. And he says, we've been at the bottom and we're not going back to the bottom. The view from the top is so much better. And he introduced this idea of accountability, discipline, effort, ADE, he called it. And he gave us bracelets, those kind of Lance Armstrong type bracelets.
Yeah.
So he gave us these ADE bracelets. And he said that the foundation of this program is going to be accountability, discipline, effort. And he meant it. And for me, that was one of the greatest things about Bronco Mendenhall is when he said something, he was going to do it. On a football team, it's easy to let accountability slide. There's a lot of players. Some infractions are less serious than others. You tell people to run through the line, people slow down before the line. But to be
Mhm.
a really good team, you need all, I mean, at the time it was like 105 or 125 of us. You need everybody to really be precise in what they're doing.
Right.
And he held everybody accountable. He was all about discipline, no stupid penalties. You got to go to class, you got to work hard. Well, and then the effort piece. Bronco's known for making people work really hard. So those are just a few things of why I loved him, why he was such a great leader. Is he was able to capture our hearts and minds through really cool experiences, and then he held people accountable. He made us work like crazy, and then we had success as well.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, the first thing I think of is how hard hiking Y Mountain is just walking. So I can't imagine the race with the teammates, but that sounds like a great time. But I love the first story you shared. I'll get into kind of my thoughts on both, but the first one where he took you guys as a team up the canyon to, write the notes of what you think was wrong with the team and then to throw them in the fire and to give a fresh start. Not only do I think that's a cool activity, but he also was showing that he cared what you guys thought. He wasn't coming in, walking in, I'm the new head coach. I'm going to come run the program. Obviously, he was appointed that leader and he was going to do that, but he kind of opened it up to you guys. So, how did that make you feel as a player to him as a leader that he was open to understanding what you guys thought and where you guys thought the program was rather than him coming in kind of as a tyrant? This is my new program. This is what we're going to do.
Yeah, in 2004, I had a bunch of friends. Well, let me back up. In 2002 and 2003, I played at Snow College,
Okay.
and most of my teammates went to Utah to play. And so it was only like me and a couple other guys that went to BYU, but I had like 10 friends that were at Utah during the Urban Meyer, like just
Gotcha.
peak. And they would tell me about the kind of organizational structure that Urban had going there. And I think Urban was ahead of his time. And I just remember thinking like we can't compete with Utah. Like all of the things they're doing, they're doing so much more than we're doing. And when Bronco came in and gave us a voice and instituted a leadership council where each
Mhm.
position nominated or voted on somebody from that position group to be a leader, and then we would meet with him, and he gave us ownership. I mean, this is something that Bronco really believed in, was giving the players ownership, and he was partially guided by Paul Gustafson. But as an example, one of the things Bronco did is he had the team vote on special teams captains, and so there's four special teams: kick, punt, kick return, punt return. So the
Mhm.
team voted on those four captains, and then those four captains ran the team. So I was voted the punt return captain. So I got to choose who was on the punt return team. I got to manage the depth chart. Somebody didn't do a good job, they got demoted. I'd promote somebody else. I ran the meetings. I would analyze the film. I would set strategy because he really believed in like the players are going to be more motivated if they take ownership of the team. So just another example of yeah, when he let us write what we hated about the team, it did give us a voice, as that's kind of language we use in organizational behavior. It did give us voice, but he's also giving us ownership. And when you have more ownership, you're more motivated.
Yeah, that's actually amazing. That's such a cool story that I'm not sure I'm sure there's great coaches that are willing to do that, but and that's what I think makes great coaches is being willing to delegate and give ownership to players or a leader in an organization of a business to, employees or whatever it is. to then perform. And I think that's where that ownership comes in. If you were now the captain of the special teams, or you're your special team, and so you had to perform, and then that obviously made you think down the chain of what are we going to do to perform? Who's going to be in places to make sure that we do the best we can? That's actually amazing.
And I should say, our special teams in 1 year went from like 75th nationally to top 20.
Yeah.
And our team, just when Bronco took over, the first year we went 6-6. We made it to a bowl game and lost to Cal Berkeley 35-28 in the bowl game. So we made the bowl game for the first time in 3 years. And on that team, there was let's see, Marshawn Lynch had 3 touchdowns and Deshaun
Yes.
Jackson had 2 touchdowns. And those were the 5 touchdowns that Cal
Yeah.
scored. And then we rattled off like 10 win seasons 4 years in a row. And Bronco just went to a bowl game every year and just had incredible success. So what he was doing worked.
Yeah. That's amazing. Kind of jumping into now, you mentioned Bronco as this amazing example of leadership in your life. I kind of want to, if you could touch on, you mentioned the things that he taught you: accountability, discipline, effort, ABE, ownership, being a leader as a teammate. How have you seen yourself, or I guess people, they understand these principles, they take what they know a good leader is doing. How do you apply that personally to your own leadership rather than just learning it and then, doing nothing about it?
One of my favorite phrases from Bronco, he talked a lot about building trust, how to build trust, gain trust. And for him, it was pretty simple: make commitments, keep commitments, deliver results over time. So that's something I try to do as a leader. I try to make commitments, keep commitments. That's one of the values that I really care about. Bronco held people accountable. If you didn't show up to practice, if you missed a weight session, you weren't going to play. So I think those are some of the things I think about. I was just interviewing, one of my favorite interviews that I've done recently was with Andy Reid, head coach of
Mhm.
the
Yeah,
Chiefs.
I've seen that.
And he talked about he learned this lesson from Lavelle. Okay, so this is, I mean, here's a long answer for you. Um, One, you just try to learn from everybody all the time. Be a learn it all, not a know it all. One of my favorite phrases. So Andy Reid is talking about what he learned from Lavelle was being a good coach is being a good teacher, being honest, and being consistent. That was one of his like primary things he learned from Lavelle was being consistent. So that's another thing. Bronco was very consistent, and so that's something I try to think about as a leader. When I'm in that position, be very consistent. People can count on me. They know what to expect. Now, I'm in kind of an interesting position where I talk a lot about leadership and I read about leadership and I research leadership because I teach leadership at the University of Kansas. But I feel much more like kind of like a coach than a player,
Hmm.
but in a weird kind of way that like I'm coaching people on leadership, but I'm not like in the trenches leading. And so one thing I like to say, I go back to Andy Reid, like Andy Reid is an amazing coach, but he probably wasn't, he wasn't the best player. He was good, he played at BYU.
Right.
And so even though I talk about leadership a lot and read about it a lot, I don't feel like I have a ton of in the trenches intense leadership experience, but I don't think that makes what I have to say necessarily less valuable. I like thinking of myself as the coach who maybe I'm not the best player, maybe I'm not the best leader, but I do know about what a lot of the best leaders do, and being
Mhm.
consistent and being able to count on that leader, which builds trust, is a really important part of leadership.
Yeah. I think that's important, and I would say, that doesn't make your comments any less valuable than anyone else's. And that's actually in some of my recent podcast episodes, one of the biggest things I've learned in my last one was the importance of research and the importance of reading, reflection, and writing, and how that makes you a better leader. And you may not be in a leadership position now. Like for my listeners, being the rising generation, people that are I'm 25, and so people like me that are trying to learn these leadership attributes and apply them, how important it is to research, study, and then reflect and apply those things, even though we may not be in a leadership position now. And so,
Okay, I couldn't agree more. And that just reminds me of a couple things. So the first thing it reminds me of is I just recently interviewed Admiral Stavridis.
yes.
Those in the military will know Admiral Stavridis, but one of the most accomplished military leaders of our time. And one of his number one piece of advice about being a good leader was good leaders are good readers.
Mm.
And I was thinking about all of the things that I've read on leadership, and I think it's helped me a lot. I've had this experience multiple times in my life where I will develop a mindset or a habit or a behavior. I'll think a certain way, and then I'll read a book that I read years ago, and I'll read about something that is like exactly how I think about something. And then
Mhm.
I realized, wait, the reason I think of the way I do is because I read this book a long time ago, even though I'd forgotten it. So I think President Hinckley, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he had this quote, and he was probably quoting somebody else, but something about how, um, I can't remember the books I've read any more than the meals I've eaten, but even so, they made me.
Mhm.
And I think this is a really important part about leadership is you've got to really thrive. You got to learn from other people because we don't have enough reps. We don't have enough experience in our own life to learn all the lessons we need to learn or that we can learn. And so when we read books by Admiral McCraven or John Wooden, one of my favorite authors on decision making, Annie Duke or Charlie Munger. So I feel like I've learned so much from these people that have helped my leadership abilities, even if I can't necessarily always remember, I certainly can't remember everything from the books I've read, but I still think they've shaped me and shaped my thinking. And so that's one thing I was going to say. And then another thing I was going to say that goes along with reading. Some of the best research on leadership comes from Ohio State. And we're going back 75 years.
Yeah.
And these researchers at Ohio State, they identified 1,800 specific examples of leadership behaviors. It's a lot of different behaviors, right? Here's 1,800 things that leaders do.
Yeah.
And then they reduced those 1,800 down to 150 questionnaire items. They had people kind of answer questions about these now 150 items. And then they were able to basically summarize or compile all of those 150 questionnaire items down to two things. And they found that these two things that leaders do accounted for 85% of basically all behaviors that leaders do. And it came down to two things. And they called it things that don't really make intuitive sense for us. They called it consideration and initiating structure. But basically, consideration is you take care of people, and initiating structure is you have good process.
Mm.
Of all of those, starting with 1,800 specific examples of leadership behaviors, they were able to narrow it down to basically two things. Good leaders do two things. They take care of people and they have good process. And so if you don't know that study, if you don't listen to that research on a podcast, if you don't read about it, you don't have that really simple framework to launch your leadership from. So if you're a young leader and you're like overwhelmed, what do I do? Well, here's a really simple framework. It's all about people and process. Maybe not all about, but that's a that's a really big chunk of leadership, taking care of people and having good process. And now, of course, it's endlessly interesting and difficult and complicated and exciting to figure out how to take care of people and how to design the right processes. But just having that people process framework is a really good starting point for young leaders.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy you say that because it just brought back a memory of me being back in college and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I mean, first of all, that whole study is amazing. Having 1,800, leadership attributes or characteristics or whatever it was down to two generalizations like that. I mean, that's pretty amazing research, but it makes sense. People and process. I remember quickly when I was in school trying to decide what major I wanted to go into, what jobs I wanted to apply for, whatever it was, which internships to go to. I remember talking to my dad, and I think it's interesting now that I have this podcast and I'm so interested in understanding leaders and how they operate. I told my dad, I said, look, I have no idea what I want to do. I don't know what industry I want to go in, but I know I want to work with good people and be on a good team and influence people. And then I also think I'm good at understanding what makes a good process and learning how to improve a process. And so I just think that's
Cool.
interesting. You say that, I wanted to work with people and I wanted to improve processes. And now I find it interesting that I now host a podcast on leadership, which Ohio State now says those are the two generalizations of leadership. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, very cool. You nailed it. You didn't even know you were nailing it. You nailed it.
Thank you. Well, one thing I'm interested in kind of your experience, Nate, as a professor, you mentioned that you feel more of like a coach or a teacher of leadership. I'm interested what your thoughts might be on the idea of someone who may not have a leadership position necessarily, like that authority or power from a formal leadership role, and how they can still be a leader and have influence even though they may not be in a leadership position.
Okay, a couple things come to mind. One, uh, people process is a really good place to start. Two, I think one of the best ways to be a really good leader is to first be a really good follower. And this is
Mm,
something we don't talk probably about. We probably don't talk about this nearly as much as we should. And I think universities are probably guilty of this as well. But because we have leadership classes, how many followership classes did you ever take in college, right?
Zero, yeah.
But how many of these graduates are going to their first job and are going to be like leaders?
Right. Yeah.
And really, what most companies want is they say they want leaders, but really, most companies want really good follow. They want people to do the job that needs to get done.
Yeah.
Most companies, this is my generalization. I don't know if there's data to support this, but this is my overwhelming sense that most companies they know pretty well what needs to get done. They just need somebody to do it. And I
Hmm.
think we have this idea in our mind that we need to uh, reinvent the wheel. We got to go into a company and we're going to have this amazing idea and we're going to change the trajectory of the company. And yes, I'm sure that has happened and it does happen. That still probably happens every day. But really, companies also just need people to get the work done. And
Hmm.
so I think as to become a good leader and to have an impact, I think it's really important to figure out what your company needs and do that thing. I
Hmm.
interviewed years ago, I interviewed Liz Wiseman, who's another great author and leadership executive, a leadership coach, was an executive at Oracle. And Oracle brought her in and was like, "Hey, Liz, we really want you to do this thing." She's like, "Oh, wow. Well, I mean, that's good, but there's this other thing that I really want to do. I want to create a training program for the company." And the boss was like, "That's fine, but we don't need that. We need this other thing." And so then she had a decision to make.
Hmm.
Do I just push on my own agenda or do I do what the boss wants me to do? And ultimately, in her words, she said she had to get over herself and just do what the company needed. But by doing that, she did such a good job with that thing. Eventually, she was able to do the other thing and create a whole kind of leadership training course, kind of, I think they called it like a university at Oracle. But it was first because she was a good follower. She did what the leader needed and then was able to do more. And so I think that's a really important piece of leadership is at times it requires us to be a really good follower.
Hmm.
And once we gain trust and show that we have competence, then we have more opportunities generally to lead.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I think it ultimately comes down, as you were saying that, it made me think to be a great follower and ultimately to become a great leader, you really have to understand the mission and vision of whatever organization you're at. It reminds me, I was doing an internship in Washington, D.C. for Airbus Americas, and I was working in the executive office as an intern to the head of strategy and then chief of staff to the CEO. And I remember my one of my first weeks, my first week, the chief of staff, he pulled me aside and he said, you're an intern here, working. I was the youngest person in the executive office by probably 20 or 30 years. And so I felt intimidated by that. And this goes along with what you're saying about being a good follower. But the only reason I was able to do that is because I understood the vision. He came to me and he said, "What is your role here? What is the whole purpose of why you're even here as an intern?" And I had my list of projects I needed to get done for the summer. But he said, I gave off, I think it's to do this, I think it's to finish this task or whatever. And he's like, no, ultimately, your vision, whatever you do here every single day, is to work towards us selling this number of aircraft. That was ultimately the company-wide vision, sell this number of aircraft to meet this goal. And anything that I did was indirect. correlation to hopefully meeting that goal, even as the youngest, newest intern at this massive company. And so I think it's interesting you say that to be a good follower and understanding how to eventually become a leader, you have to be in line and aligned with that core mission and vision of that company or organization, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I know of many companies who don't have, like a strong mission or a strong vision. And I think it's important. It is clear that many companies can succeed and thrive without like
Mm,
their mission and vision everywhere. And I think sometimes those companies probably look at a professor like me and are like, we're fine. We don't have this real strong mission and vision and we're fine. But I think, like you said, when the mission is clear, it helps clarify for the employees what they should be doing so that when there is that moment where there's some ambiguity about should I spend my time on A or B, when the mission is clear and you know exactly, the point is to sell more, okay, well, that can help guide that decision. So I think that can be really valuable.
right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Well, Nate, I've loved so far what we've talked about, and thank you so much for sharing the stories you have so far. So far, I've just got a couple more questions for you, and then we'll wrap up if that's all right.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, one of the things I love to reflect on for all my guests is whether they've been, in these crazy, advanced leadership positions or they're a professor, whether they're in the military or business or whatever it is, we've all grown and become better leaders throughout our lives. And so one of the things I want to ask you is, as you look back on your own life, whether that's going through law school, being a football, being an athlete, being a professor, whatever it is you do now, if you were to look back on your life, what advice would you give to your younger self about leadership and growing and becoming a better leader?
I think this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier with reading. I love the phrase "be a learn-it-all, not a know-it-all." I learned that from Brad Smith, who's the president of Marshall. He was the former CEO of Intuit. When I interviewed him, but that mindset of just like learn as much as you can. And I think for me, when I was younger, I felt intimidated or maybe incapable of being a strong leader. And over time, I've really changed my mindset on this to where if I can't do something, it's either because I haven't learned it yet or I just haven't had enough practice. And
Mm,
that's pretty much the filter I'm running all the time now. That if I need to get better at something, it's not that I'm incapable. I'm sure there's some things maybe I'm incapable of, like playing in the NBA, for example. But for the most part, I feel like if somebody else has learned it, I can learn it. And if I'm not good enough at it yet, I just need to keep practicing. And I think it can be intimidating for young people to look at the leaders in their lives and think like I could never do that. I remember I served a church mission in Chile when I was 19, and I remember I went to this meeting and there were some 20, 21-year olds that led like a 2-hour training in Spanish. And I just had that thought. I had the thought I could never do that. And a year later I was doing it and I was doing it just fine. And that was just a year, give yourself 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I think it can be quite surprising what we're capable of as long as we keep learning and progressing and as long as we get practice doing that thing.
yeah. I really like that. I think in anything, whether that's leadership or learning any new skill, I think understanding where it is you can go and understanding the path to get there, that if someone else has done it, there's examples for you to think and not to sell yourself short. Like that example you gave about, serving a church mission, you came from the States, probably didn't know Spanish,
Yep.
and then 2 years later, you're doing that and maybe even better than you thought you ever would have. So I really like that. And that kind of actually covers the last question I wanted to ask you. Maybe if you have anything you want to add, feel free to. But my last question was going to be, for what are some, maybe one last impactful statement or one principle that you hoped, young people like me or the rising generation would carry forward in leadership. But I think, unless you have anything to add to it, I really like what you just shared. Never sell yourself short and keep moving forward. Maybe you can't do something now, but that doesn't mean you can't do it in the future.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. And I try to teach that to my kids. And that's one of the reasons I started this podcast was to share lessons that I really wanted to pass on. And that was, I think, episode 2 was kind of this idea about like, what's the role of education and what's the role of college? And it provides lots of It checks lots of boxes, but that's one of the main things. But let me just share one more thing since you asked, because
Yeah.
I always got a lot to say
Yeah.
about this. One of the things that I think is really important, and especially in an age of AI, is being able to connect with people. So the best research on developing trust, which, if we're going back to that people process framework, connecting with people building trust is a really important part of that. And the research shows that to develop trust with somebody, we need three things. We need, or to gain somebody's trust, I guess is a better way of phrasing it. They need to see that we're capable so that we have good ability. They need to see that we care about them, and they need to see that we have integrity. So they call it ability, benevolence, integrity. These are right from the leadership research. Lots of research supporting these three factors being the most important to build trust with people. And in an age of AI and online virtual interactions, I'm concerned that this benevolence piece really doesn't get, uh, people don't appreciate it as much as they should. And
Mm.
so some of my final advice would be really care about people and try to connect with them, especially as a leader, because you can think as a leader, like, okay, I'm really competent as a leader. I know exactly what I'm doing and I'm honest. I'm full of integrity. People are going to follow me. It's like, but if they don't think you care about them, they might follow you, but they're not going to trust you. They're not going to follow you as much as they would if they also knew you cared about them.
Right.
So how do we do that? Well, I was just consulting with a company last week, and what I suggested they do is in every meaningful interaction, they should always send at least one signal that they care about the person they're interacting with and not just the work. And I think that's a really underappreciated, important behavior that we can all engage in as leaders, when we're followers, when we're in a flat hierarchy, whatever interaction we're having. If we show people that they matter and it's not just about the work, we care about the people, I think that's a really valuable skill. I think nothing's more powerful than love and the connection we create with each other. And it can be easy as a leader just to focus on the task, focus on motivation, whatever. But trying to connect with people, I think, is something that will never be unimportant, even though many things will become unimportant as AI continues to progress.
Yeah. I think that's such a good reminder. And thank you so much for talking about that. And I can, Nate, as a personal note to you, I can attest, I've known you for a little under a year now since we came out here to University of Kansas. And I can tell you that, and to those listening, that, Nate is a great example of that. Every time we've interacted, every time we've had a conversation, you can always tell from you, you are a great leader. Even in your personal interactions, I can tell that you care about me. You're asking questions about my personal life, whatever it might be that we're talking about, building a podcast or whatever. I can also tell that you care about the person because I felt that myself. So thank you for sharing that. And I think it's a great reminder. And thank you again for being willing to come on. I've really enjoyed the stories you've shared and the principles you've given insight to.
Appreciate it, Jackson. Always love to talk about this. I can say the same about you. I've always felt like you care about me and care about others as well. So it's cool you're already applying this just the way you were already ahead of your time on people and process. So
Well, thank you,
thank you.
Nate. Thank you for spending time with us on the Front Lines of Leadership podcast. Leadership isn't about the position you hold. It's about the responsibility you accept and the people you serve. Take a moment to reflect on one principle from today's conversation that you can apply immediately, at work, at home, or in your community. Small, intentional actions compound into real leadership. Subscribe, share, and join us again as we continue to learn from leaders who show us what it means to lead from the front lines.